Chair, Deputies, I'm pleased to address the House on the second stage of the Work-Life Balance and Miscellaneous Provisions Bill. The purpose of this bill is to ensure that Ireland fully transposes Articles 6 and 9 of the EU Work-Life Balance Directive, which are the final elements not already compatible with Irish law. The bill also fulfils an important and long-standing commitment to extend the entitlement to breastfeeding breaks under the Maternity Protection Acts. With this extension, women returning to work after having a baby will be entitled to these breaks for 2 years after the birth of the child. Breastfeeding numbers in Ireland remain low, particularly for extended breastfeeding, and these breaks make combining the return to work and breastfeeding a bit easier and also normalises something that can still have a stigma attached to it. And today my colleague, Senator Pauline O'Reilly, highlighted the importance of the issue of breastfeeding and the supports that the state can put in place for breastfeeding in a motion before the Seanad. I want to confirm also that I intend to bring committee stage amendments to the bill which will introduce a form of paid domestic violence leave following the Domestic Violence Leave report, which includes recommendations on how best to support employees experiencing domestic abuse. Addressing domestic, sexual and gender-based violence has always been a priority of mine, and I'm very pleased to be able to bring forward these legislative amendments, which will mean that Ireland will now become one of the first countries in Europe to introduce a right to paid leave for victims of domestic violence. Domestic violence leave is intended to provide a key support to victims of the SGBV who are in real distress. A requirement for evidential proof that a person has been victimised could serve to undermine the operation of the legislation. Consequently, for the initial 2-year period of the operation of the leave, there will be no requirement for a person to present evidence in order to avail of the leave. The application of the leave and the effectiveness of the legislation will be reviewed at that time, and if issues arise with respect to misuse of this leave, changes may be made to permit employers to ask for supporting evidence should they so require it. I met recently with Minister Jan Tinetti, the Minister for Women in New Zealand, and she spoke very positively of how the introduction of domestic violence leave had encouraged greater openness and awareness of domestic violence in all its forms. I now turn to outline the main provisions of the bill. Section 1 is a standard provision. Section 2 provides for a number of definitions related to the provisions of the bill. These include a definition of flexible working arrangements, which includes remote working arrangements, flexible working schedules or reduced working hours, and a definition related to significant care or support for a serious medical reason. Section 3 provides for further definitions, including a new Section 3A to ensure that employers who have had successive contracts with an employer fall under the new entitlements. Section 4 provides for necessary consequential amendments. Section 5 inserts a new section, 13A, into the bill to provide for leave for medical care purposes. This new form of leave matches the provisions of Article 6 of the Work-Life Balance Directive on carers' leave. The Carers Leave Act 2001 already provides for a form of leave for those with caring responsibilities, but for a more extended period. In order to meet the requirements of the directive for a form of leave which can be taken flexibly and without a notice period, it was necessary to introduce leave for medical care purposes. Under these provisions, up to 5 days leave can be taken in any 12-month period. The leave can be taken in individual days or consecutively. The leave is available to care for a child for whom the employee is a relevant parent under the Parental Leave Act, and also to care for a spouse, civil partner or cohabitant, parent or grandparent, brother or sister, or a person who resides in the same household. The leave is unpaid, and in order to provide the necessary flexibility required under the directive, it's not possible to provide a social protection benefit. An employer may also ask for information regarding the nature of the relationship with the person for whom the employee will be providing care, and information on the need for the care, which may include a medical certificate or some other form of evidence. Section 6 includes new sections 13B, 13C, 13D, 13E, 13F and 13G into the Parental Leave Act, which outline the right to request flexible working and the procedures which must be followed by the employee and the employer. These provisions give effect to Article 9 of the Work-Life Balance Directive. The entitlement follows the same lines as Section 5 for parents and carers. A request must be made in writing, setting out the form of the flexible working arrangement sought, and be submitted not later than 8 weeks before the proposed commencement of the flexible working arrangement. As with the leave for medical care purposes, the employer may seek further information. An employer must respond no later than 4 weeks after the request has been submitted and approve the request, refuse the request and provide reasons for the refusal, or where the employer has difficulty accessing the viability of the request, inform the employer that the 4-week period has been extended. Under the new Section 13D, the employer may postpone the period of flexible working for a period agreed with the employee where there would be serious operational challenges for the business. This mirrors similar postponement provisions for parental leave. The new 13E allows for changes to the flexible working arrangement as agreed between the employer and the employee, and 13F allows for an early return to the previous working arrangements. The new 13G provides for the termination of a flexible working arrangement where it is not used for the purpose for which it was approved. Sections 7, 8 and 9 amend the Parental Leave Act to extend employment protection to employees availing of leave for medical care purposes. Section 10 makes some technical amendments to Section 21 of the Parental Leave Act. Section 11 inserts a new Section 21A into the Parental Leave Act, which sets out the direction which may be made in a decision under Section 41 or 44 of the Workplace Relations Act 2015, where an employer has failed to comply with the procedures set out on the right to request flexible working in the new Section 13C. Sections 12, 13 and 14 make further consequential amendments arising from the provisions in Section 5 and 6 of this bill. Section 15 amends the Maternity Protection Act 1994 at Section 2.1 to provide for a new definition of employee who is breastfeeding, which extends the entitlement to breastfeeding breaks under the Act from 6 months to 2 years. As I outlined, this will fulfil an important commitment. This section also deletes Section 7.2 and amends Section 16.1 by substituting the term woman or other person for the term woman. These small number of amendments are necessary to ensure that the entitlement to the maternity leave is available to any person who gives birth. This language has been slightly amended from the general scheme proposals following consultation with LGBTI+ organisations and women's organisations, and has been deemed the most inclusive form of wording with which we can proceed. Section 16 provides for an amendment to the Adoptive Leave Act 1995, which stem from changes made to the Act through the Family Leaves and Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2021. Section 17 provides for necessary consequential amendments to the Organisation of Working Time Act 1997. Section 18 amends the Workplace Relations Act 2015 to correct an anomaly which arose as a result of the Children and Family Relationships Act 2015 being enacted shortly before the Workplace Relations Act 2015. The amendments to the Workplace Relations Act 2015 reflect the legislative intention behind Section 176F of the Children and Family Relationships Act 2015. The section also provides for circumstances where the mother of a baby has died and the other parent is not the baby's father, to allow that other parent to bring a complaint under the Maternity Protection Act 1994 to the Workplace Relations Commission. So, Deputies, this bill brings to a conclusion the implementation of the Work-Life Balance Directive by the addition of two new important provisions: a right to request flexible working and the right to care for medical leave. It also addresses a long-standing commitment made by governments a number of terms back to extend the applicability of breastfeeding breaks from 6 months, where a mother takes up the full term of her maternity leave, basically renders that right non-existent, to 2 years. And finally deals with an issue that has been debated extensively in this stall, in the last stall, and I know Deputy O'Reilly raised this issue in both stalls, the issue of introducing paid leave for victims of domestic violence. So 4 important central developments in this piece of legislation. I look forward to hearing Deputies' views on the proposals, and I commend the bill to the House.
Thank you very much, Minister. And now to Sinn Féin, Deputy Louise O'Reilly, 7.5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here this evening. I suppose I'll start by saying a lot of what's in this bill wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be debating it if it wasn't for the fact that you've been compelled by the EU directive on work-life balance to do it. The changes are some of the changes are welcome, but I think we need to note the government have a lot of flexibility on how they are going to implement this directive, and you can take the measures as far as you want. So, Minister, I suppose that you didn't address this in your opening remarks, and maybe you will when you're closing. Are we talking about paid leave? Because the sick leave bill that your government have introduced is effectively excluding a lot of middle to low income workers, because if you don't have the money to go to the doctor to get the medical certificate, well then you can't avail of the leave, and that's very regrettable. It won't be worth the paper it's written on. certainly it won't deliver for low and middle income workers if it's not paid leave. The crux of the bill is aimed at parents and carers, two very, very important groups, provides the right to reasonable access to flexible working arrangements, and of course this is welcome. The majority of caring and parenting responsibilities are undertaken by women. We know this, we don't need to keep saying it, but for some reason it's often said and stated, but it is a fact. The committee report on this bill said that we must ensure that flexible working is open to all workers. So it's best to address existing gender inequality in caring and parenting. When flexible work is not shared between men and women, or when by virtue of their design interventions are imbalanced, this has the potential to reproduce existing caring and employment inequalities and reinforce gender stereotypes and differences between work and care. Research has shown that flexible working arrangements provide employees with enhanced job control. And indeed, when I was a union official and when I was a shop steward, we would have campaigned for flexi time, and I can tell you it absolutely changed the lives of the mostly women as it goes, because that just happened to be the workers I was representing. But it was very, very positive intervention because they got access to flexible working, but they didn't have a consequent reduction in income. And I think that's where we need to focus things now. Where a worker has greater job control, it leads to reduced workplace stress. It's also been shown to reduce absenteeism and staff turnover while increasing productivity. Not that you think that to hear some of the chat earlier on in the previous debate. For most workers, it offers the opportunity to cut travel costs and allows them to manage their childcare and other caring responsibilities. But flexible working arrangements can't all be about caring and parenting. People have lives too. They have other things that they may wish to do, and they want to be able to manage their work a little bit more effectively to do that. Flexible working helps workers to work their full hours, but also to square off time that they might need for an event, for an engagement, or for whatever they want to do in their own spare time. This benefits both the worker and the employer. It would be welcome if the Minister would speak with his colleagues in government about examining this. I would also ask the Minister to speak with his colleagues regarding the idea of a 4-day week. Same job, same goals, same salary, but over 4 days rather than 5. That offers a huge opportunity. This move would grant greater flexibility for everybody, could also be revolutionary in terms of gender equality, allowing better distribution of caring responsibilities between mothers and fathers. And again, the key there is there will be no consequent reduction in income. This is especially important for low to middle income workers, because they are people who simply cannot afford to take time off, and you will know this obviously, ministers. Many trade unions and workers' organisations believe that now is the time to take that leap, to move to the 4-day week, or certainly to even just mainstream the conversation about it, take it out of the side and into the centre, and have a very real and meaningful look at it. And finally, I want to speak briefly on the provisions of the bill with regard to domestic violence leave. You alluded to it yourself, Minister. For years we have been advocating for paid leave for victims and survivors of domestic abuse. I introduced what I would describe as comprehensive and stakeholder-led legislation in the Organisation of Working Time Domestic Violence Leave Bill 2020 to do just this. So it's very clear that if we are to end the epidemic of domestic abuse in this state, we need a whole-of-society response that both supports and protects women. And a key element of this is ensuring that women are protected, that victims, not only women, but it is mostly women, are protected in their workplace. And that and again, I'm going back to the issue of continuing income, that their income is protected. And that's really important. And you know, if you've ever been with someone in work who is a victim or survivor of domestic abuse, the capacity for the abuser to exert financial control over this person can be absolutely huge. The liberating impact of having access to your own money cannot be ignored. And so that's why it is absolutely imperative, not alone that the legislation is done quickly, and my own legislation is at committee next week, but that it is done without proof. And I welcome what you say, although you walked it back. You said there won't be any need for proof in the first 2 years, but then we might introduce it. I think it would be preferable, and I think the stakeholders as well would very much feel that it was preferable if you took it off the table altogether. I don't feel that it's necessary. I don't believe that people will abuse the legislation. But I do want to ask you, Minister, and I want to an answer from you, if I could, in your summing up. 10 days is what's provided for in my legislation. I understand that you're talking about 5. So I raised this with on Taoiseach yesterday, and this is a direct quote, he said, "It's a very good start, but we will revisit it." So I suppose my question relates to the people in the third level sector who were told by your colleague, Minister Harris, after he and I launched the 10 days leave in NUIG, that he wrote to the heads of the other universities and requested that they would follow suit, that they would do the same as NUIG has done. So I suppose my question is, are you taking 5 days off those workers? They're public servants working in the university sector. Are you taking back 5 days from them? Are you slashing their entitlement in half? Are you going to create 2 tiers within the civil and public service so that there are some that have 10 because they just happen to come in before your legislation? Or is it the case that you will accept what the sector have said, what stakeholders have said, what lobby groups have said, and indeed what we in Sinn Féin and others in the opposition? And I note I had my legislation at committee previously, and there wasn't a dissenting voice, not from any party. So it's very important that we get clarity on that. I believe that 10 days is the appropriate number. I understand that half of that is what is the proposal, but I suppose the simple question then is, where stands the people who now have 10? Is it your intention to slash their entitlement in half? I think that would be very regrettable, and this is a positive move. It should have a very positive impact on the lives of victims and survivors, and I think the way to do that is to listen to the sector, to respond to what they are looking for, and indeed either to back my legislation for 10 days or to make your own legislation fit in with what your other government colleagues are saying.
COVID-19 didn't come to us bearing any gifts, but it did bring us a new awareness of how we are living, both for better and for worse. Many people have made major changes to how they work and live, and I know there are many and many more who would do so if they had the proper opportunity. We know too, during the lockdown, that there were many fathers who welcomed the opportunity to spend more time with their children and realised what both had been missing out on. This bill here also transposes an EU directive on the issue of work-life balance. It's both timely and welcome. The work development we read about now, so-called quiet quitting, is so much more than a headline or a soft feature. People are re-evaluating their priorities, working to live as opposed to living to work, and the quiet in their working lives brought about by the pandemic made them realise that much of their working life is superfluous to our busyness for its own sake. As a culture, we sometimes put busyness up there on a pedestal where people are trying to outdo themselves, saying how they worked during pneumonia or the flu and all this, looking for medals. People back at their work desks only days after childbirth, and President Biden boasting about going to great lengths to tell us how he was working from home during COVID, as if it's not just desirable but also required. Work-life first and life very poor second. But if we are to live well and work well, flexibility is needed, and this is especially the case when it comes to full participation by women. So the incentives outlined here are welcome, but they must be matched by equal improvement in affordable and accessible childcare and other essential childcare. I have lost count of the number of women in North Kildare, highly qualified women, who say to me that they are considering having to give up work because they just can't get the childcare they need. Because generally, for the privilege of earning a percentage of what their male co-workers might work because of the gender pay gap, these women, they hand over their children generally to other women. So they have to, even taking the gender pay gap, they have to earn enough to pay 2 women to work just for the privilege of working, and there's real solidarity in that act. And the women who mind these children, they deserve to be paid well. Other mothers tell me that they are thinking of giving up work because they can't get a place on the bus in Scolia for their child to get to school. And it's especially galling for them because they were kind of presented this as if it was something that they were getting for free. So the provisions of this bill depend on getting many other things right in the state as well. Like the buses, we had the go-ahead, we were talking about go-ahead buses this morning, and we're so time poor, you know, and we're waiting for buses that don't turn up. Workers fed up to the gills on late or final warnings from their employers. So we have to get the balance right, and this is the basics, like our public transport. Somebody to mind their baby would be a good place to start. I hate the phrase "joined up thinking," but good God, it would be good if we could get on with it. In that context, I'd like to point out as well how my party has called for payment or allowance for medical care leave, and that lone parents should be entitled to double the amount of leave for medical care purposes to account for the absent parent. I'd also put you on notice that I'd be bringing forward an amendment to this bill to bring around a 10-day fully paid leave for parental bereavement leave, because the trauma of burying a child is a heartbreak that some people in this chamber have experienced, and an ordinary 2 or 3 days isn't sufficient. 10 is also the number. I'm talking about 10 a lot because I believe in decimalisation and leaving imperialism behind as a Republican. But 10 is the number also that we propose for domestic violence leave, which was introduced by my comrade Louise O'Reilly and our party leader, Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald, which does not appear at the bill at this stage, but I hope it will appear at committee stage. And I hope you'll clarify that. 10 days is what Sinn Féin proposed, because 10 days is now the norm in organisations and companies where that leave has been established, and it's normal in universities and a lot of big companies as well. I know Vodafone have 10 days. In New South Wales, they're moving from 10 to 20 days, as I understand, but the proposal in this legislation is to be 5. And at the Gender Equality Committee this morning, the Taoiseach seemed to indicate that 5 would be a given and that employers would follow on what they consider to be best practice. So we'd love to have that clarified, because, as Deputy O'Reilly said, our people who know that they would have 10 days leave now, are their rights going to be halved? But victims of domestic violence need to be able to rely on 10 as their right, and no favours, no kindness of strangers, just their right as employees. I think that it would make that part of their life simple when the rest of their life is anything but. The Taoiseach also made it clear to me this morning, and I was relieved to hear that despite IBEC's demands for proof and the Minister's report stating that employers, quote, employers should retain the right to request reasonable proof, there will be nothing of the kind. Proof should not be demanded and proof should not be required. So I was glad to see the Taoiseach distance himself so adamantly this morning and so publicly from your report on employers' rights. But I see here as well, you're kind of saying that you're going to review it after 2 years, as if there's some kind of moral hazard from women, and it is mainly women who suffer from domestic violence. And while I try to behave myself when I'm speaking in this chamber, but the ghosts of dead women sometimes come into my head. And while we might be, it's just, a few hundred years ago, women were held underwater to check if they were telling the truth. This moral hazard around women who experience domestic violence is just, take it out, please. Because demanding proof of being a victim of domestic violence is just not a wise move. It would show that there are no lessons learnt. And I know that that's a phrase that this government love to use, that, lessons learnt. But it would show that there are no lessons learnt in departments that are mired still in the legacy issues that how this state has treated women. And commuting women because they did, or because they might, removing their children, sawing their pelvises, because in what passed for maternity care, refusing them life-saving abortions, fighting them in the courts on their deathbeds, and using their own money, public money, to do so. So, Minister, I've told you before that I believe you drew the short straw, because I do believe that the greatest trick that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael pulled off during the government negotiations was to leave it to the Green Party to clean up their 100 years war on women. The physical, psychological, emotional and moral war that was waged by successive governments on Irish women against women and children, and especially their version of the wrong women and poor children, since the state was the foundation of the state. So I do understand that you don't have it easy, Minister, but look back at the Taoiseach in the Gender Equalities Committee this morning and how he was so defiant in distancing himself from your recommendations in your report. and ask yourself, like, don't do their bidding, Minister. So I look forward to seeing 10 days domestic violence leave added to committee stage. 10 days. 10.
Minister, the piece of legislation here, of course, comes from the directive from the European Union, which is welcome. That there's progress been made in all of these issues, and I think, you know, the whole notion of work-life balance is something that always comes to the fore, and has been mentioned by my colleagues, particularly for women in many of these circumstances, who have to balance very much a family life very often, and to try and incorporate a work balance into that. And, you know, as we see the price of houses soaring, as we see the price of living soaring, very, very few families can survive on a single income, and therefore both partners in a relationship usually have to work. And that means that sometimes, if the particular employer is particularly difficult to deal with, when you have situations like this, you find that family life can often suffer. And I think that needs to be brought into this piece of legislation, and much in it is welcome, as has been said. However, we do feel that it doesn't go far enough in many aspects of it. And as I mentioned by my colleague, and I was just thinking about it as I came down here, of particularly people who live in rural Ireland, and I come from a very rural constituency, and for the last month we've had mainly women ringing me at all hours of the day and night, and I'm sure that the Cathaoirleach would have the same experience in County Clare, about school buses and school bus tickets, and they can't get their children to school. And what are we going to do? And I can't get to work if I can't get the children to school. And the absence of forethought, I think, around family life, for to do that situation and to make that change, I think is a poor reflection of an appreciation of what's required for proper work-life balance in our communities out there, and particularly for people who very much, for to earn a living, depend on the school bus for to get their children to school, and for that to be taken away from them. The other issue that was of course very important in regard to this is the issue of domestic violence leave. And I recently dealt with a young woman who went through a very traumatic experience, and one of the most difficult parts of it was because she needed her independence in the situation she was in. She needed to continue working, and the employer she had was particularly difficult around all of that. And I think that the demand for 10 days, I think, is certainly the minimum that will be required in those circumstances. I think we also, and I think of it in coming into my own area in justice, we often deal with people who are also the victims of crime, and the victims of serious crime, and the trauma that can bring onto their lives as well. And, you know, there's issues around that in regard to how employers deal with all of that. And while we shouldn't have to always legislate for these things, unfortunately, because of I suppose, the type of winner-takes-all capitalist society that we live in, very often we do actually have to legislate, and we often do have to force employers to do the right thing in the most difficult of circumstances. And I was just thinking, as my colleagues were speaking there, in regard to the event we've had in Donegal, and the tragedy of, you know, that has brought 10 families in a small rural community, and what that has done to them. And, you know, we have to think of, you know, the difficulty that death can bring for families, and how very many people who may be in employment in those situations will certainly need to see that their employers will need to be flexible, and will need to have elements of work-life balance brought into that. And unfortunately, we have to legislate for it, as I've said. Of course, since COVID came in, we've seen a lot more people work from home. We have seen flexibility. We have seen employers embrace that flexibility in many cases, and that is welcome, and is moving in the right direction. But there still is a lot more needs to be done. And I think, you know, the right for people to be able to switch off at appropriate times when they have things to do, and when they, and you mentioned in your earlier remarks in your speech, Minister, in regard to breastfeeding, and that's very welcome that that's put in place there. But I do think that, you know, you need to get clearer in respect of particularly the domestic violence aspect of this bill, as to how long that women are going to be given the correct level of.
Deputy Sean Sherlock, Labour Party, Fihil Ahmed.
We welcome the bill. We welcome the clear language by the Minister in respect of the domestic violence provisions, where he states unequivocally that a requirement for evidential proof that a person has been victimised could serve to undermine the operation of the legislation, and consequently for the initial 2-year period of the operation of the leave, there will be no requirement for a person to present evidence in order to avail of the leave. in the Minister's response, he may come back to us and tell us why a period of 2 years was chosen. It seems to me to be quite an arbitrary period of time, but notwithstanding the fact that the principle applies, that there is no evidence required, which is welcomed, I question why it has to be 2 years. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make is just in respect of the wait period of 26 weeks and the flexibility around that. And that's in section 6, part 5 of the bill, where, and I quote, "For the purposes of this section, where an employee ceases to be the employee of an employer and not more than 26 weeks after the date of cessor, the employee again becomes the employee of the employer. The period of service of that employee with that employer before the date of cessor shall be deemed to be continuous with the period of service of the employee with that employer after again becoming such an employee." I'm trying to fully understand what that means, but we'll parse that over the coming weeks and certainly before committee stage. You may give us a further elucidation of that point exactly, because if I am reading the language of the bill, what's coming across to me is a greater degree of flexibility on the part of the employer to say no versus the requirement we would contend for the legislation to be embedded with a right on the part of the employee to be able to access such leave. And I'm trying to get a sense of what's inside the Minister's head in terms of where he stands. If I was looking at the constituent parts of government, I imagine that the Green Party would be more in favour of the rights of the employee. If I was looking at Fine Gael and probably some elements of Fianna Fáil, I would say there needs to be greater flexibility on the part of the employer to say no. So I just want to try and get a sense of where the government is coming from that point of view. I say that because in section 113D, the grounds for the refusal seem to be very loose. And we're going to seek to amend all of these if we perceive that the arrangements are too loose, such that the very existence of the legislation in terms of what it seeks to do, in terms of the transposition of the EU legislation, is such that it does not fully vindicate the rights of the employer. Also, in relation to section 13B, for the Minister's officials, and part 3, why have a cut-off age of 12 years of age? Because if you have a child where there is a long-term illness payment, for instance, they qualify up to the age of 16. And I would contend, Minister, respectfully, that 12 and 16 are unrealistic and premature cut-off points. So perhaps the Minister, we certainly will be seeking to amend that element of it as well, and perhaps the Minister could come back with his perspective on those provisions. I also want to mention, while I have the opportunity, the fact that there are so many families in Ireland where fertility issues arise and miscarriage arises. And it's the silence of that for families that is one of the hardest things, when they're going through fertility treatments or where miscarriages arise. Some of the figures that I have suggest to me, and this is open to further examination, that around 14,000 women experience miscarriages each year. Around 1 in 6 couples experience fertility issues. Now, not all, require or want treatment, but for the many that do, we have to ensure that the appropriate workplace leave is available to people. And we are going to propose some amendments to this legislation to meet those requirements, because I think it's high time that we as a society acknowledge the fact that miscarriage exists. I think there is there is the beginnings of a greater openness around the conversation around miscarriages. But I do think that it would be a good thing if we, as a society, legislated for the requirement and the need for people sometimes to have that leave. Where you have compassionate employers, there's never an issue around these matters. However, not every employer is compassionate, and we think that our bill, which we published in March last year, which would provide 20 days leave for women who experience early miscarriage, with an additional 10 days paid time off for workers who wish to access reproductive healthcare treatments like IVF. We think that that is a sensible solution, and that's, if the Minister has a response to what I'm saying now, I'd welcome it, but we certainly will be seeking to amend this legislation to recognise the fact that people require leave for miscarriage and for fertility treatments. And I think that would be the hallmark of a progressive society if we were to do that. And the Minister mentioned, I think, New Zealand, and New Zealand received global praise for introducing paid time off for people in the workplace who experience a miscarriage. And, I think it would be a great victory for women and for families if we were to follow suit in that regard. I note also that there are specific provisions in relation to breastfeeding, and we absolutely welcome those. I stand here before you as a man about to hit the age of 50, but I have a very young family, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a little girl that was born in July. So I know something of these matters, let me say. But I note that the Minister made specific reference to the Green Party motion in the Senate today about Senator Riley, I think it was, and the motion in respect of introducing measures in schools, lessons in schools around breastfeeding. I would be far more satisfied, I think we all would be far more satisfied, if there were more lactation consultants operating throughout the state at present. Because if we are to be serious about the fact that over 1.58 million was provided for, to hire 24 lactation consultants, it's all well and good having motions in the Senate, and they're laudable in their own right, but there is a responsibility on the Green Party as well, I would suggest, to ensure that, as part of government, that even though you don't control the health portfolio, there is a collective responsibility to ensure that those lactation consultants are hired. Because that would have a massive impact for families where those advices are needed. And it costs over €100 if you want a private lactation consultant's advice at present. Not many people can afford that. And it's very easy then, where there are issues around breastfeeding, for people potentially to become discouraged if they don't have access to a public healthcare service where there is the required number of 24, and this is government policy to roll out the 24 at a cost of 1.58, then I think it's incumbent on the Green Party, the Fine Gael Party and the Fianna Fáil Party to make sure that they do everything to recruit those consultants into the system. And this is pertinent to this bill, I think. I really do believe that it is pertinent to this bill. So I will leave it at that, Chair. There are specific issues that I have raised in respect of, the rights of the employee versus, the flexibility that I read across this legislation in terms of the tone of the language of the legislation, which seems to my mind at present to give a greater balance of power to the employer. And I think that, respectfully, I think that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sorry, yeah, we're doing a bit of musical chairs here. I have speaking time myself. Minister, I want to join others in support supporting the legislation before us here tonight, the Work-Life Balance and Miscellaneous Provisions Bill, a very positive piece of legislation. And I know that you, as a Minister, have been leading this forward in your department for some time. So the bill transposes various elements of EU work-life balance directives, and it also provides for rights to parents and carers to help support a better work-life balance. Under this bill, parents and carers will see a number of improvements, but firstly, a right to request flexible working, including the right to request compressed or reduced hours, the introduction of 5 days per year of serious medical care leave, the introduction of an extension of current entitlement to breastfeeding and lactation breaks under Maternity Protection Acts from 6 months up to 2 years. The bill also sees, and I think other members have spoken to this, the introduction of paid leave for victims of domestic violence. I know we have given examples of other countries where this happens in best practice. This is a very good starting point, a starting point that I would hope will be improved on as well, Minister. And then finally, and I have a number of points to make after this, supports for employers to develop domestic violence workplace policies. There were a number of things that struck me in the bill. I was a school teacher before getting elected to Dáil Éireann, and in our school, and indeed in most schools, there are policies which set limits or caps on how many people can seek job sharing in a particular year. And it's not to be mean or vindictive or anything like that, it's just for operational reasons in the school. When you have someone on job share in a school environment, for example, the teachers midweek would change over. And it actually works well from a children's point of view, from a learning point of view. There's a certain energy to all of that, but it's very onerous as well. You have to exchange notes, assessments and everything. So schools do find it a bit onerous, and for that reason they generally cap it. So in a typical large school environment, there might only be 2 or 3 job shares allowed in a particular year. Obviously, legislation passed by the House of Oireachtas would supersede that, but just operationally, I think it's good to give consideration to this as the next stages of the bill get underway. I think teaching is rather unique in that regard. I don't know of many other employment settings where there are caps or limitations on it, but it's for operational reasons, and I think it's just something maybe to some hour in the week to chat with the INTO or some of those unions and just see why is it there, and is there a way of not banjaxing a school's work schedule whilst also fully enshrining the spirit of this law that you're trying to introduce. I think it would be very good and positive work. The 4-day working week was mentioned by some speakers here a short while ago, and I know government tinkered around with this, and I think it was the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment last year that set up a working group to look at this. It was trialled in Spain for a particular period, and there was much fanfare. I think every radio show in the country had caller-ins excited about this, and the working group went underway and they got their work underway, but we didn't hear a whole lot about it. I think that's very crucial to work-life balance, because people want to work but live as well, and I think we'd love to hear what's coming back on that. Employers do too. They have a lot of concerns. I think that isn't exactly in this legislation, but it's something people, I think, are hanging on a thread to hear what's happening next. In terms of remote working, this has been transformative in rural counties, particularly during COVID. I hope I get my number right, but I think we have 14 remote digital working hubs in County Clare at this time. I've worked in them occasionally during COVID. TDs, I know you're in a relatively urban, pretty much an urban constituency, but in a rural constituency during COVID, I could be back in West Clare doing clinics, and I might have to be logging into a committee here in the Dáil in the afternoon. And I used to stop in the car. You'd never get good signal in the car, of course. You'd have to stop in the digital hub, and for €5 you could go in, tea, coffee, full facilities and comforts there, log in. So you could be looking out at the Wild Atlantic Way, but connected here to central Dublin, and indeed to people on a global basis, working, transacting and doing everything you need to do. They were transformative. Clare happens to have the most of any county in the country, but I would love to see more and more and more of that. Look, Minister, it's a positive bill. I wish it very well going forward. I think there have been some constructive contributions from the floor that I've heard so far here tonight, but I do say as a teacher, just to engage with the employment bodies, with the INTO, just to see is there an operational way this can work, because if you have a school with, now it's hard to imagine, but if you have a school of 20 teachers and all 20 of them are on job share, then you suddenly have a staff of 40, and it just becomes a little bit tricky to manage, I would say. But we do want it to work, so I think for that reason a little bit of dialogue would help this. So I'm done, Minister. I have to go back to the Chair, but hopefully some of those contributions can be factored into the next stages of this legislation as it progresses. Thank you. This just to be clear for the remaining speakers, this debate has to end at 7:24. So I'm next going to call on Deputy Mark Ward from Sinn Féin. You have a 3-minute contribution, Deputy. Thanks very much.
Okay. Minister, this bill on work-life balance is timely and welcome. We've seen during the restrictions put in place during COVID-19 that it created a greater need for flexible working arrangements. And while COVID was and still is a very serious issue, the lessons that we learned from that period should be key to our approach to issues around caring, disabilities and equality going forward. This bill sets a framework for flexible working arrangements, offering many benefits for employees and employers. These are important tools for better assisting women and people with disabilities to work. They promote greater gender equality, work-life balance and improving child and family well-being. There are many aspects of this bill that are welcome, including a right to flexible working, including the right to request compressed or reduced hours, and the introduction of 5 days leave per year for serious medical care. The extension of current entitlement to breastfeeding and lactation breaks from 6 months to 2 years is also very welcome. Unfortunately, Minister, another lesson that we had to face during COVID restrictions was the increase in reports of domestic violence. I'm a member of the Joint Policing Committee on South Dublin County Council, and only last month we received a report stating that 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime. Gardaí deal with between 500 and 600 calls per week. That's 30,000 calls annually. In reality, Minister, that's every 17 seconds there is a call reporting domestic violence. That's an absolute blight on us as a society. And while this bill is very positive development, we have several concerns, particularly around the domestic violence leave. My colleagues Mary Lou MacDonald and Louise O'Reilly introduced the Organisation of Working Time Domestic Violence Leave Bill, which passed second stage in December in 2020. It is currently going through the pre-legislative scrutiny at the Children's Committee, which I am a member, and I must say, any time that it's come up at that committee, it seems to be a cross-party agreement of what that bill is about. Sinn Féin's bill is a comprehensive piece of legislation drafted with the OPLA following an extensive consultation. It provides a 10-day statutory leave. Proof of abuse is not required, which is really important, but it also protects employers where they believe the leave has not been taken for its intended purposes. Similar standard provisions are provided for employees who believe they've been wrongly refused a leave. And while this bill before us today is a very positive development, we have several concerns. As I said, 5 days fall short of the 10 days that Sinn Féin have in their domestic violence bill. And we've seen it in the north where legislation was brought in that had the 10 days, so it's been done in other legislation. Minister, this bill is welcome, and with a bit of political will, it could be so much better, and we will be tabling amendments, and I hope you would support them going forward.
Thank you, Deputy Ward. I apologise in advance. We're going to guillotine this at 7:23 just to move on to our stuff. So, Deputy Holly Cairns.
Thank you. I'm sharing time with Deputy Gannon.
Yes.
We need legislation that reflects social realities. Employment law needs to recognise the complexities of life, caring for your family, the importance of one's health and the experience of the victims and survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. In comparison to other European countries, Ireland has poor worker rights. We lag behind many in family leave policies with low payment rates and short duration of leave available. Greater flexibility in work practices enables women, disabled people and others to enter and stay in the workforce. At the outset, I also want to say that there are many incredible employers at all scales, from family businesses to multinational corporations that have very positive and progressive leave practices. This law is for the other type of employers, and we know that they exist too. It's for those businesses that will only ever provide the bare minimum. With this in mind, the bill needs to ensure that it has robust measures to ensure that workers get the leave that they're entitled to. It's easy to frame additional leave entitlements and workers' rights as anti-business when they're often tools that help broaden the workforce and improve employee morale. There is no reason we cannot have successful and comparative businesses along with a health work-life balance. It's too easy for political parties to say they are pro-family when they don't support pro-family measures and employment rights. There is a lot to welcome in this bill, and it must be acknowledged that it originated as European legislation and another example of rights achieved through our membership of the EU. The government has transposed elements of the EU directive, but there are caveats and limitations in the bill that need to be addressed. In most cases, the bill implements the minimum standard, in contrast to other EU countries that have already surpassed the minimum, recognising the importance of different types of leave. The first that are of concern relate to the right to request flexible working arrangements for caring purposes such as caring for a child, a parent or a spouse. The Children's Committee pre-legislative scrutiny report was very clear on who is entitled to flexible working. All workers, no restrictions or small print. We stressed the importance of applying this provision to all workers. Unfortunately, the government has retained the requirement for workers to have at least 6 months' service before they can have this leave. This restriction will disproportionately affect certain groups, such as lone parents and workers on temporary contracts. One family highlighted that the 6 months employment eligibility criteria will directly contribute to the ongoing high rates of poverty and deprivation for one-parent families. This provision in a bill from the Minister for Children will make life harder for one-parent families. And important to note actually that one family will be celebrating 50 years of existence tomorrow. They do incredible work for one-parent families. However, I do recognise that there is a subsection dealing with the cases of successive fixed-term contracts and acknowledge the cumulative total of the employment. My second area of concern is around privacy rights. The Department have repeatedly demonstrated an inconsistent and often disputed interpretation of GDPR, especially in relation to mother and baby homes and illegal adoptions. While in many of those cases, the Minister has held up privacy rights as an issue surrounding access to information, in this bill, you're showing little consideration for those rights. Under the sections dealing with leave for medical care purposes and flexible working arrangement for caring purposes, workers applying for these forms of leave would have to share information such as a birth certificate or medical certificate relating to the person that needs care. However, unlike medical leave for oneself, this requires the sharing of personal information relating to a third party. For example, a parent who needs flexible working hours to care for a sick child or a child with a disability would have to produce a birth certificate to firstly establish that the child is theirs and that then share incredibly personal information about that child with their employer. In its strictest reading, the perspective we have to take, as I mentioned, this law is for the employers that will interpret it literally, giving only what it permits. The bill requires a third party to give up their privacy rights. This becomes most clear in the case of caring for adults. What happens if a worker knows they have to take leave to care for a sick parent, but the parent does not want other people knowing their business and will not give permission for that information to be shared? The pre-legislative scrutiny report specifically sought for clarification on what happens when that third party does not consent to the sharing of the information. In addition, we asked for clarifications on the obligations of the employer regarding the processing, storing and destruction of that information. This is also absent from the bill. The issue of sharing information also arose recently due to news reports on IBEX submission concerning leave based on domestic violence. When we had discussed domestic violence leave at the committee, there was a strong consensus that it would obviously be a good faith system that employers would not abuse, nor would workers seek some sort of evidence.
Yeah, Deputy Cairns, I'm very sorry. The debate finishes at 7:23. You will be in possession of the time again tomorrow. This debate recommences at 1:44 tomorrow, so you'll be again in. So you might move the deferral of this, if you don't mind, please.
I move the deferral, and Deputy Gannon will be taking up the time, so he'll be in possession of the time.
Thank you, and apologies.